come closer. 더 가까이. 더 가까이. 나 이거 촬영하는 거 어떻게 생각해?
소인이 생각하는 거하고 우리 1세들이 생각하는 거하고는 갭이 있걸랑.
30 years after the 1992 LA uprising, my family is some of the last generation of Koreans who still own liquor stores in predominantly black and brown neighborhoods. But even after all these years, when I step into my parents' store, it's as if we're stuck in time. My dad is the hardest working person I know. He managed the family liquor store 15 hours a day, 365 days a year.
그리고 아빠가 가게를 팔고 리타이어 하는 것이 아빠의 꿈이야, 지금 현재.
Whenever I feel discouraged, there's one person that inspires me. Danny, a fellow liquor store baby.
After my dad passing away, my mom running the store by herself, I ultimately made the decision to quit my job and do my thing here.
You didn't feel like you had to forfeit your dream because of this?
Yeah, I'm happily here.
Maybe my fear of the liquor store has something to do with it. I might turn into somebody that I don't want to be.
아빠는 할 수 있는 게 이거밖에 없잖아. 지금 문 닫아야 돼. 빨리 집에 가자.
진짜 싸움은 이 경찰이 흑인 남자 죽어서 그래.
너는 내 거 아니래서.
그 차이 너무
올려서 그렇게.
When Koreans are trying to make a living and black folks are trying to make a living, it's the same system.
Anti-blackness in Asian communities is severe. We don't have time. We have to educate ourselves.
How do we use this space for folks to come together?
The value of life is when we begin to help each other.
Change is all relational.
I want to honor my parents' struggles by transforming the past and creating my own future. But most importantly, keep dreaming.
근데 그것도 아빠 입장에 땡큐야. 자랑스러워. 자랑스러워. 뭐 점심 먹고 싶은 거 있어?
Keep going, Tyler.
The bus is coming.
Oh, cool.
It's right here.
Oh, that's a dog.
Yes.
Nice.
A service animal.
What kind of service does your dog do?
He's a guide dog.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you're blind now?
Uh-huh.
Well, you want me to describe myself to you?
Sure, why not?
Oh, I'm so cute. Got a nice smile.
I believe it.
My eyes are clear.
After you have a disability, you're gonna have some type of impediment. But the intersectionality between being undocumented and having a disability, it plays a lot of stress and anxiety into you. I decided to study social work. I wanted to help people. I wanted to give an opportunity for those that they didn't have an opportunity. On our path, there are gonna be some obstacles. So I want you to go swipe left and right, cover from shoulder to shoulder, just to see if you can find out obstacles. Here's an obstacle. And hey man, you're doing quite good. I hate that narrative of like the good immigrant. Especially when it's like, hey, he's blind, he's undocumented, or he's going to college. Oh, he must be a saint. Yes, I'm here. I was able to make it this far, but how many people have to sacrifice for me to get a chance?
When a happy when die, smoke is in your eye.
It's okay. Rea, don't take my picture.
You want to take my picture? Look through here. You can take my picture.
Is that right?
Okay, now you have to ask me a question.
Didn't your mother show you how to raise steak?
You're my mother.
There's nothing to do here.
Now, did your father come from Japan? Was he born in Japan, or was he born in the?
He was born in Japan.
He was born
so
in Japan.
what you call a Jap. My mama and papa grew strawberries.
Strawberries.
Yeah.
They had a strawberry farm, and that was probably taken away.
What about Vince Tajiri? There is no Tajiri. We have a father named Vince Tajiri.
No.
Mom, come to dinner. Mom.
You gonna hurt me?
No, I'm gonna take care of you.
You have to learn about yourself. Why I'm this way, why I'm that way.
And what are you learning about yourself?
Oh, you'll be surprised. You will be so surprised.
So yeah, so such distinctive visions, right, that were present in the trailers that we just saw. And one of the things that I want to have this conversation about, because the name of the panel is A Story Only You Can Tell. And part of this telling of these stories is your distinctive vision, right? And I was wondering if, I'm going to direct the question, in line, but so Rea, the toils and joys of care, right? The blurring of memory and identity that comes with dementia. And the unique approach to a renewed and deepened understanding of your mother as you time travel with her, right? How did this vision take shape?
I had not set out to make a film about my mother, but my mother was diagnosed in 1999. We were having these really interesting conversations, but I think like most people, I think in the beginning, in caregiving, it was just overwhelming, it was daunting, it was depressing, it was frustrating. But in between, I would have these amazing conversations with my mother that were very, resonant and enlightening. And people would say, oh, you have to film this. And I would say, no, it's very private. We can't do that, And then over time, I started just sending clips to family, and I think around 2012, I was sharing some footage with my students, and they encouraged me to kind of like, no, your mother's really compelling. This is going to be amazing. So I did intentionally start to do this, and it was hard to know as we were going, like what kind of film, how to set this up, what to do. I kind of envisioned, I wanted to capture this kind of sense where my mother would share something with me, and then suddenly we would be going back and forth to different parts of her life, different places. She mixed up Chicago with where we were at now. So it was really fascinating because it was a trip through her mind. And I think the other lesson that I learned was how do you, in the caregiving process, to embrace wherever her mind went and to enter her world and not to correct her, which is a really key thing, and to really try to accept her for where she was at in that moment and just in general. So once I think I got the hang of that, I really started to think about how the film could mirror that. And it was tricky because it was verite. I had shot it like thinking it was going to be verite, but I don't make verite films. But anyway, we tried it. It didn't really get to the other levels. So I really decided to go in this other direction, which was to lean heavily into archival, because my father was a photographer, and I wanted to lean heavily and sort of share, like in looking over those archival materials, like really seeing my mother at all these different decades, different phases of her life, different identities, and so how to bring that forward And the other aspect that I came up with was to do a set piece. I wanted to do more. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but I wanted to create set pieces that would be meaningful to her and symbolic of her life. So the beauty shop was one of the set pieces that we created for her, and then she could come in and respond to. So those were some of the ways that I, worked with, setting up form and storytelling. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really touching, and I wanted to sort of hold that for a moment and think through how the other panelists have also done the work that they did for each of their films, and I think set is not set, the irony is not lost upon me that your film is called Unseen, and we're talking about asking you to speak about your vision that you had for your film, right? The film has a very distinctive approach towards the use of depth of field and focus, and so how did that come about in terms of thinking about the form and how it connects with the perspective of your film?
Yes. Hi everyone. I just want to say I'm so humbled to be in this panel with Rea and Robert. I'm like looking at superstars and I'm just like, wow, I'm literally sitting here next to them. And I just want to also build upon what Stephen was doing earlier about naming ancestors and those before us. I just want to really lift up Tam Tran, who is the OG undocumented filmmaker in my life who passed away over 10 years ago, and making films about undocumented community from the perspective of undocumented community. All that aside, or all that in the forefront maybe, I also just want to say that I know I'm being invited here to Robert's question about the process of making of the Unseen and the choices. I would say maybe 60%, majority ultimately, of the process of making the film. I had no idea what I was doing. Things, I think sometimes what I've come to learn, especially, I don't know, maybe other folks are more planned, than me. But I think sometimes the process of making this film was listening to the guidance of spirit, ancestors, whomever, intuition to a certain extent, community and collaborators. I think maybe in Western filmmaking, there's this strong belief in the auteur, who's the vision of everything. Maybe to a certain extent, some people are really that talented, I just want to name, I'm this film, me, Pedro, this whole project was done through a village. And to Robert's question about the visual style of the film, a lot of it was with the intention of accessibility. Pedro, the film is about, my friend who happens to be blind, and how do you make a film that's as enjoyable to the person, that the film is about when he's blind, as it would be for another person who is sighted? So in my conversations with Pedro, he kind of was the one who guided me through audio descriptions. And in the process of kind of learning more about audio descriptions, I learned that you can watch a film by listening. How do you invite sighted viewers of a film to, yes, watch with their eyes, but not so much lean in visual information as opposed to what's being presented auditorily? Incidentally, in the edit, we learned that the visual style of the film kind of says things also about the themes of the film, about showing ourselves to people, being vulnerable, which in essence is showing our authentic selves to other people, and maybe other things too.
Yeah, and and so your film Liquor Store Dreams features you and your family at its core, but it's really also anchored in a very specific history and a community, and and your film tackles interracial dynamics at play in downtown LA, right? So why was it important for you to include this perspective as part of your film that is part of your vision?
Well, thank you, everybody. As like a cinephile, I watch like a movie a day. I just watched every film related to the LA uprising and was trying to figure out how do I make my favorite movie and how do I make something that only I can also make, but also that I can learn from, because I wasn't seeing the movie that I wanted out there yet. So in that process of watching all the LA uprising films, I didn't see like certain perspectives. So I said, okay, let me just write down everything I want to see in one movie. And that's pretty much how I ended up with this film. And for me, if I'm gonna tell a story about my own history, about our ties to the LA uprising as a community, it would feel wrong or like not. Why am I even making a movie if I'm not going to make something more conclusive or go to a scary place or like really confront things that that I was hoping not to do? I also think that this is a thought I always have, that now filmmaking is so hard that for me it's not worth it if it's not super important. So I always have to think, there's that saying in life will always throw you challenges again and again till you learn that lesson. And that's kind of how I sat with this film. I was already gonna make this type of movie, but then once the pandemic hit, once after, George Floyd passed, so many protests were happening, I feel like as Americans, as people in this world, we were grappling with so many things and they kind of just erupted during this time. And so this was that moment where I was like, oh, I need to go there. If I'm making this film, if I don't talk about certain issues, like why even make this in the first place? And for me, I prefer to not sugarcoat things, or I rather kind of go to that scary, like follow that scary feeling because you know it's right, because you're scared of it. And I think that's kind of how I came to the conclusion, try to, fit everything.
No, it's so amazing to hear both you and Seth talk about sort of, in a way, an act of listening, as anchoring both of your engagements with the film that you did, right? And listening to yourself in terms of feeling what was missing in terms of all the films that you had encountered, and in the process of making the film with Pedro and your community of film collaborators, right? As well, and that's, and I wanted to see if Rea, if you wanted to, chime in on this and to think about like the collaborative relationships that you've had,
sure.
Both for Wisdom Gone Wild, but across the many films, and what challenges have you faced and what lessons have you learned about these collaborative relationships? So it's a multi-part question.
Yeah.
I got it in my brain. Let's just tackle one.
Sure. So yeah, the listening thing is interesting because that is a really big part, I think, became a really big part of my mother's care, was really listening very deeply and slowing down because, she spoke very slowly and, as we age, our brain functions differently. So it was sort of like recalibrating and really slowing down and really engaging actively. And when I did that, then my mother would actually kind of also like open up and share a lot. So that was a really interesting part of the process. And collaboratively, there were a lot of, collaborators on the film. My mother, it wasn't like we sat down at a table and mapped out how we were going to film, but I think she engaged with the filmmaking process very actively. So a lot of people will ask, about consent, and I will say that, my father was a photographer. He photographed us constantly. We were used to be on camera. My mother, was a little bit ambivalent about being on camera, but when, I think during dementia, and we had this sort of lifelong kind of playfulness because I was always filming her, and she'd go, stop that, like home movie stuff, but during dementia, she started kind of engaging and kind of became this very astute person who was very astute, aware of the camera, would kind of do these subtle things, and she was very into it. So, and also knew when the camera was on and would start to kind of perform little things. And so it was kind of interesting in that regard. about participation and like with somebody. So I considered that and her collaboration. The editing, of course, was collaborative. My editor, Catherine Hollander, was here, and I had 2 previous editors. I think it took a while for me to find this film, and I think that in the end I knew that what it was is that I had to, I do usually edit my films and then bring in an editor at the end, and so I had to kind of stop the process and kind of recalibrate and begin again and really create a template, a working template, and explain formally what I wanted, and we started again. And I think I also music and sound design is really important. And this is so funny because like right at the beginning of the film process, 10 years prior to when we started working together, I had met my young cousin, and he was an aspiring, he was a musician. He was already making music, and I heard his tracks, and he had these beautiful ambient beds in his, there's these R&B things with these long ambient beds, very moody. And I said, these are really amazing. Maybe you can do the soundtrack to this film. And then, we kind of lost touch. And then by the time I reached out when it was 2021, he had already been he was out of school, working as a music supervisor, was just leaving his job, and he was going to start doing film composing. It was perfect timing. And so we collaborated. And I think the 3 of us, the editor, Catherine and Shakuru, and actually my brother, but he was more in the background. We had done some recordings with his percussion a long time ago. But we all kind of got together and kind of figured out how to score the film, how to work with the music, and passed music back and forth. So that was a very fun and process. I think it's been a long journey to figure out collaboration. And it's not that I'm not a generous person, but I also sort of feel I think I get derailed easily, and so it's hard to kind of sort of hold my ground sometimes, and sometimes that's ended up in conflict. Had conflict with producers from early on. I think that I tend to be very I was trained as a visual artist, and so I think that path is very much like you're in your studio, you call the shots, you make all the decisions, and so I think translating that into filmmaking has always been I have a very tight control because I'm just used to doing things. But I know that, I've had to learn to let go of certain aspects of filmmaking. I know I can't do it all myself. And it's sort of trying to figure out, what's a good balance, and what should I take on? What should I let someone else come in and offer assistance with? And that's a sort of ongoing, I think, challenge for me as I go down this path. I think also, just everyone always talks about this, and I tell this to my students about relationships. Obviously, we know this, but learning how to have a professional relationship with your collaborators and what that means. There's always going to be kind of a closeness because of the way I work, and building trust, and I think learning all those, I think it's a lifelong journey. It's just like relationships, how you build relationships and interact with people is a lifelong journey, but how to creatively collaborate is also, for me, been a lifelong journey. It's been interesting watching students learn that, and I learn from them, So as much as I have to tell them and prompt them and watch them, try this, fall down, stumble, be successful, it's just been, it's been a very interesting kind of road, so.
I'm so grateful for the honesty with which you're answering my questions. I'm like, oh my goodness. No, it's great, because I think, it's a room full of filmmakers, I talk about the filmmaking process in this current day and age is like trying to thread the eye of the needle while falling down a flight of stairs, and it feels like that sometimes. And I think it's really the community that you are collaborating with that makes it sort of filmmaking beyond just, a solo effort. because you pad each other's fall. You can, right? And I think rather than going on to like the other parts of the questions that I had, I was thinking, as I was listening to your replies, I was sort of thinking through sort of how history, a sense of identity, is, and the search for that has, it's not resonant just in your film, but for example, through the opening night film, for those of you who were there last night, at a very sort of tonally different film, but it was definitely all there, and sort of the burden of having to explain yourself, your history, that you belong, to account for yourself and to excel, and the burden of that, right? And what it means to engage in a practice that speaks to a community where that burden might be lessened rather than intensified. And I was thinking, so I was wondering if you could be willing to sort of tackle this a little bit. It's like, what were you willing to explain and what were you willing to not explain as you sought to like craft this film, your film?
I felt like I was pretty stubborn in my vision because I was like, I'm gonna only do this and I'm not gonna explain anything. Like I'm only gonna really make a film for my main audience, obviously, are Korean Americans, Korean diaspora. And so I didn't feel like I wanted to explain anything beyond what I felt like needed for the film. So for filmmaking's sake, I just wanted to have enough context, but I didn't want to have to explain any cultural things. I didn't really want to cater to like white gays or anything. I just wanted to feel, I just wanted to do right by my people. Like that, if they saw it, they'd be like, yes, because they can be kind of judgy. And so I think that that was kind of like my North Star, that as long as I felt like, okay, well, how much should I explain? Because sure, to me, I'm not thinking, like we screened in Prague like 3 weeks ago. I could have never imagined we would screen in Prague. So my only thing was, I'm just gonna screen it. My main audience, as long as they understand. And that was kind of the goal. And eventually I went so narrow that and this what happens, like when you get so narrow, it becomes universal. And so I think that's kind of how I didn't feel like I needed to cater to everybody, because to me, I'm like, I don't care if you don't like the film. Like, I'm gonna make the film that I wanna make. And at least it has to stay true to what I wanted. And so I think the burden was really, can I tell this story right, at least by me and my parents, because it's their story. Because even if I showed it to other Korean Americans, they might be like, oh, but that's not my experience. But I think people always say it's true because it's your experience. No one's gonna deny your experience. So I think as long as I felt I was being pretty honest with myself, that then everything kind of would fall into place.
And Sat, you mentioned it sort of brief. You touched on this a little earlier, and so just talked about what it meant to make a film for her and her family, and to get it right. And I know that you've been sort of mulling through what does it mean to make a film about my community, right? And I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that, and in making a film about your community, sort of what have you learned about yourself in that process?
This question, oh, I'm sorry, I got excited. Also, I'm a very expressive person, but wow, I'm reflecting on everything that everyone has said. I guess, what am I trying to say? I feel like with Unseen, maybe responding to Robert's question and also reflecting on what So just said, I'm an undocumented immigrant, and that is the main experience that I share with the film's protagonist, Pedro. Aside from that, not really much. He's a Cancer, I'm a Taurus. Nothing else aside from being undocumented. But that experience is such a big part of our lives. So, am I a part of Pedro's community? Is he a part of my community? To what extent is my community? Like, what are the lines? What are the borders of community? I think maybe sometimes also, you know, maybe like also with my background in impact producing, you know, I reflect on the conversations about outsiders making community about insiders, or like a community that we're from, you know, and I feel like maybe it's more complicated than like, you know, a binary issue. You know, maybe we're all part of each other's community to a certain extent. Maybe that's what, like, you know, community is all about to begin with. And I reflect also on like what So was saying. I think for me, when I watch a movie during the pandemic, like I had a very difficult time emotionally. Like I felt so lost in life, you know, and I would watch a movie. Like I watched, for example, Wild with Reese Witherspoon, you know, like, and like I do not relate to anything about, like I'm not from Reese Witherspoon's community, you know, she's not part of my community, you know, but I relate so much to what the film was talking about, you know, and I guess ultimately for me during the pandemic, watching movies felt like going to group therapy. When I don't know the feeling I'm going through, and then I watch a movie that kind of captures the feelings that I'm going through, it gives me words or a sense that I'm not the only one going through this thing, you know. So in the case of our film, you know, the process of making the film and the sharing of the film, you know, we didn't want to explain what it means to be undocumented. We didn't want to explain how Pedro lost his vision, because I think especially when it comes to films about disability and undocumented immigration, and in our case it's both, you know, there's an urge that people put on us to explain, how are you undocumented? Why did you become undocumented? How did you lose your vision? You know, like, what kind of vision loss do you have? Like, those questions maybe do matter to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, I wanted to capture Pedro's journey as a human being, because he is more than just his disability and his immigration status. And I think also, you know, for me, in the course of, you know, like navigating this process with him, I think it's also about building a community that really reflects the experience of what Pedro is going through. So for our team, you know, we were very intentional that our filmmaking team reflects the lived experiences that Pedro goes through, because I cannot capture everything. And how can we make sure that we have feedback from, you know, different folks to really shape the story of our film?
Yeah, I'm just like taking it in, because it's like, I'm like, huh. I mean, would you, like,
So interesting. It's an interesting question, because I think in the beginning stages of making the film, I felt this weird obligation to explain. And part of this was feedback that I was getting, but it never felt right. Like, you know, explain this, explain that. And I absolutely hated that. And I did feel like I was setting up a weird reflection back, you know, of people looking at us or looking at me. And I think that I also felt, you know, at a certain point to scrap that idea of like, you don't have to explain anything, and the explanation is in the sort of immersion of, you're just in this experience, and maybe I could set up with a few lines in the beginning for people to not sort of misrecognize what my mother was experiencing, and then just leave it. But I also, what's interesting was that in the caregiving part of the, when I was taking care of my mother, her doctors did not know anything about the incarceration during World War II, and they would come in to see her, and she would mistake them. She would sort of like, somehow she was going back in time and seeing the white doctors that would come and visit her as somehow she was back in camp. And so she was starting to tell them things, and they were like, okay, what happened? Because we're getting these stories from her. And then once they found out, they said, this actually really helped us to realize that a person's history impacts their care. And I was like, okay, I thought that was obvious, but anyway, it was like, this kind of history is really useful for us to think about how to care for her. And I was like, okay, great, So it was hard to kind of, like, I went back and forth, but I think that one thing that was interesting is when I did take care of my mother, I was able to bond with people who were very different from me, because we all, they would be other families in the assisted living, and we all had this common experience of caregiving our parents. And in those conversations, I sort of learned, like, what would be significant, what would be important to other people to, to sort of see or be recognized or feel when I was making the film. And so that was really useful. But I didn't want, I was sort of balancing. I didn't want to explain too much, but in the end, I think there was a whole section towards the end of the film where we go through my mother's history because of the photographs that we have and how much of a story they tell. And I did have to kind of fill in. And it was really hard to find the right balance of storytelling and sort of narrative voice. So I didn't feel that I was, like 101, Japanese incarceration, and how to, and also, I realized too, just like you say, I think with personal films, the more specific, details, people kind of, there's something about their brain can kind of like really latch onto something in a different way that's significant and powerful. So, yeah, I agree. It was a really interesting aspect. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so marvelous to have this conversation with you, and I think I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for audience questions. So if you have a question, I'm going to ask that you or somebody who can ask it on your behalf can come up over here, and then I will hand you the mic. And as people make their way up, please do, don't be shy. I'm going to ask sort of the final sort of question, and this one is, I sort of warned you that I might ask you this question because we're watching trailers. Trailers is a distillation, but it's also communicating something about your film to anybody who might watch it, whether it's those of you here, or those on the internet, or those at a festival, right? What was that process like? Because I'm in front of a room of filmmakers. So what was that like for you? And how did you navigate that process to produce the trailers that we saw? Yeah.
Even though this is my first film, I always feel like you need to have a little aspect of being slightly delusional if you want to do it. So for me, my thing is like, I'm just going to get the best people. Like, I don't care how, I don't care, with no money, we're just going to make this film happen. And that's kind of how this film happened. So my friend I was looking for a trailer editor, and my friend recommended somebody at Universal. His name is John Cantu, he's amazing. I sent him the film and he's like, I love it. Give me everything immediately. And he really understood everything I was going for. Like he would edit all the, Jordan Peele and just did Cocaine Bear. Like my head is like, whoa. So for him to really just want to help me so much and like make this happen, and he really understood exactly what I wanted to go for, especially because with trailers, everything can kind of be misleading. So for me, I just wanted it to feel like exactly like the film and just as emotional. Like I get choked up every time I watch it. So that's kind of the like I like to make movies for me. So like if it hits me, that's kind of the emotional, how I even made my film, is that if anytime I get emotional or anytime I get bored, either I'll keep it in or cut it out. So that, I think we just found a really good person that just delivered, and it's been really amazing, and I'm glad that for me, I just wanted to do my own film justice.
So it's not, yeah, I mean, it's not just about finding the right person, but it's the right person with a set of skills who sees and shares your vision, right? And I think that that's something that, you know, that marvelously came together for your trailer. And I was wondering if Rea and Sat can talk about their experience.
Yeah, it's funny because the advice that you get is that, you know, you don't have your editor cut the trailer because they're too close to the film. But we defied that rule. But actually, Catherine, we talked about it a lot, and then we were like, well, what scenes would be in the trailer? Do you think if we were going to do a trailer, you know, like, oh, got to get the best scenes, yeah. And then Catherine had gone to this like trailer editing camp, and said, you know, I think I have some ideas. And so she came back. And she said, I'm going to do, you know, like there were these different rules and, you know, you do this, you do this. So she came back, she said, let me cut one using the template, the rules. And I'm like, okay. And she cut this trailer and it was so like amazing in the sense of like, it looked like my film was a Hollywood movie, which it's not, you know. And I shared it with my nephew and he goes like, oh wow, grandma is a star. You know, like it made my mother look like this, like, it was fantastic, but it was like, yeah, but you know, I don't want to, again, I mean, you know, they get the film, they look at it and it's like this slow paced, it's like, it can't do that. So, you know, subsequently, she worked on it again, and it's, I think it's a beautiful trailer. It does all the things, it's, you know, it like really connects, and people who see it just go, oh my God, you know, and so it goes for the heart, right? And I think that, you know, it was also instructive to me to just see, you know, picking up like the best features of your film and the messaging and trying to stay honest and true to that without silling it out, you know, making it look like it's something it's not. Although I did get a kick, we all got a kick out of seeing my mother look like she was this like, boom, you know, action, like whatever. It was really funny. Yeah, but yeah, so.
I love how everyone has their own process. For us, I don't know if Josen is here, Josen Ronquillo, my younger sibling. They're actually the one that cut the trailer because they're also our post-production producer for the film. My family, in essence, helped in bringing Unseen to life. And I would say the trailer, actually, the structure of the trailer, when we had our first ever sample, when Pedro and I first started filming in May 2016. Oh my gosh, it's May 2023. It's been like 7 years, yeah. The structure of that trailer is pretty much the same one. It's always been that same, I guess, idea of how to structure the story. I would say also, I think for Unseen, you know, to my point earlier, like a lot of our collaborators, this is the first feature that we worked on, including myself, you know, and I think so much of the ethos of the project is providing opportunities to uplift the talent that exists in our community. Because I think often for filmmakers who are from the undocumented community, filmmakers from the disability community, our talents are often overlooked. So how are we gonna get experience if no one's gonna give us the opportunity? And if I'm not gonna do that through the project that I'm doing, who else will, right? So, and also I should say the reason, you know, I think the desire for that also is because when I was first, I don't know if PJ Roval is here also, like PJ was the first person ever to like provide me an opportunity. So many people from ADOC, oh my gosh, ADOC, like, and CAAM, you know, like people provided opportunities when I had none, you know, and how can I pay forward the generosity that community has given me? And I feel like in so many ways the creation of our film and even to our trailer was very much embedded in that ethos.
Such a shy room. Nobody has any questions? So yeah, I know it's true. It's hard to come in front of the camera, right, from behind. I see a hand. You can. I'll repeat it here.
Hi, I was just wondering, watching your trailers and talking about these amazing films, there's a lot of intersectionality of identities throughout your films, like, you know, dealing with elderly parents or having disabilities. So for
So the question was about intersectionality and identity, and how that is present in each of your films. And was there a specific thing that you felt like you did with your film that you're like, nope, I'm not going to do that because that is cliche, that is a trope, that is not the experience of complexity that I have moving through the world, and that was rendered on screen. That should be rendered on screen.
Okay, maybe I'll start. You know, I think when I think about our project for the way we made Unseen, I think so much of it is about intersectionality. You know, like, we're not all exactly from each other's community. We don't all share the same identities, but we share something of each other, you know? And I think part of creating the film is, you know, pretty much, it's about access, it's about intersectionality, it's about generosity with each other. You know, I think part of what the film, well, maybe like you should all come on Sunday also to watch the film so that I don't have to fully explain what the film is about, you know, because it's kind of hard to sometimes explain, because the film is about so many things. It's not just about Pedro, you know, and I think for you know, Unseen, a lot of the desire in shaping the film is finding ways to be, to create a community, you know, like creating the film was pretty much creating a coalition, you know, because I feel like in the process of making the film, we had to interact with a lot of different folks with different personalities. Maybe sometimes being a director is like leading a coalition, and maybe if you're an organizer, you're probably very ready to become a director too, if you'd like, you know. Maybe actually not, who knows. But I feel like how do we bring together the voices, the experiences, the perspectives of different communities, you know, to uplift the story of a very specific experience. And maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that I think is present in all of your films and that hasn't really been voiced yet is the deep, abiding ethic with which you connect with those rendered on screen, right? It's not, you know, and I think that's one of the things that is, when we think about intersectionality, or when we talk about intersectionality, or we talk about identity, and why it would be considered a box is because it becomes commodified in a particular way. And then it can, once it becomes commodified, it can be extracted and recirculated for profit, right? As opposed to an actual process of relationship, of being in community through the process of filmmaking, which is what I'm hearing about each of your processes, right? And so it's a very different ethic and an approach towards filmmaking. You know, in your trailer, it was like filmmaking as care, right? That's not how we usually think of filmmaking. And that was very present and visible, right? And I think that that's something we can think about as we think about what do we mean when we think about identity? And are we banding about in ways that like actually undercut the relationships that are necessary to build the forms of, you know, sustainable joy that we want to be in. So on that note, I think I'm going to wrap and thank the panelists for being here.